Hello to everyone out there, and good morning to some, good afternoon to some, and good evening to some. My name is Bjørn Enge Bertelsen, and I'm the director of the Global Research Program on Inequality, and welcome to this book launch. And I have the immense pleasure today to moderate this launch for a book that I believe is truly important, a work that links tax justice to global inequality. Now, before I say a bit more about the book and we proceed to discuss it and present it, I have two pieces of information that I need to share with you. For one, this event will be recorded and will be made available on the GRIP website and in our YouTube channel later on. And secondly, we do really want this to be an interactive session, and we will therefore have a Q&A session later. So please, therefore, use the Q&A function to post your questions. And if you have other comments, please use the chat function for that. Now, the book that we will hear more about in a few minutes could not, in my view, have been published at a more critical time. For propelled by the current pandemic, we know that at the moment, millions of people across the globe are pushed into poverty. A proportionally much smaller group of people continue to accumulate their wealth, and crucially, doing so without paying any significant form of taxes. Taxation is nothing more than a mechanism to fund the social contract, says the editors of this crucial book in their opening salvo. And I think they're quite right in many respects. For one, taxes and taxation is key to development of statehood, redistribution, and welfare, as we know. Second, a notion of a social contract need perhaps, but we can discuss this also, to be upheld in a time when tax planning abounds and across the globe. This is a time, sadly, when many billionaires funnel their wealth into their own charities instead of contributing to their own countries as taxpayers, to cite one example. And thirdly, we also know that what the editors call aggressive corporate tax avoidance is a systemic global problem. So more than being just a question of economics, it is therefore very helpful that the editors outline political effects of continuing a current regime of tax evasion, involving, for instance, greater political instability. This is a central claim of the book. Despite the dire current circumstances of aggressive tax planning and avoidance of large corporations, a great thing about this book is that it provides practical and context-near pieces of advice to how developing countries can tackle such a situation. It is in this moment of widening global economic inequalities that calls for more fair and just taxation are raised in the book, and we will hear more about this later on. Centrally, the book asks, how can countries secure resources for their development, and how can tax systems help to address inequalities? In order to present and discuss the book, we have assembled two of its editors here. One of the editors, Krishen Mehta, is a senior global justice fellow at Yale University and a former partner at PricewaterhouseCoopers. He has also worked extensively on tax fairness and tax justice, both as an academic and working with NGOs or foundations. Erika CU is a tax and development policy specialist and is currently affiliated with the University of Illinois at Chicago. She has worked with the United Nations Development Program as well as the International Center for Taxation and Development. Erika has also been director of the Independent Commission for the Reform of International Corporate Taxation. And I'm now very pleased to give the, digital floor to Krishen and Erika. So please, let us hear more about this wonderful book.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bjørn. And my sincere thanks to you and to the Global Research Program on Inequality at the University of Bergen for sponsoring this event. Now, if we really step back for a moment and reflect on the teaching of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, it's important to remember what he said. He said that the ultimate test of a moral society is the kind of world it leaves to its children. The ultimate test of a moral society is the kind of world it leaves to its children. And if we consider the fact that there are three main crises that we need to address at the present time, if we want to leave a more just and a fair society for our children and grandchildren. One crisis is this whole area of nuclear confrontation and devastation that could be caused if there is, if the nuclear weapons that are there currently are not constrained and brought in better control. We know the impact that'll have on future societies could be devastating. A second crisis is dealing with the climate and the fact that we have climate devastation, climate catastrophe. 70% of the United States is now covered under snow. We have hurricanes. All of that is also within our reach to try to address and to heal if we want a better world for our children and future generations. And the third area, which is the subject of our book, is how do we address this increasing issue of global inequality? The fact that both in the developed countries and in the developing countries, there is significant accumulation of wealth in one portion of the society and significant economic deprivation and poverty in the other section of society. And this is happening in the West and in the developing countries in many parts of the world. And our premise in this book is that global inequality really needs to be addressed if we want to stop the flow of refugees, whether it is in Europe or people coming to the United States. And then there is all this political dialogue as to whether there should be a wall built to stop the refugees from coming and so forth. But all of these movements and civil wars and refugees are a reflection of the inequality that has come about and the economic desperation and the political instability that it has fostered. So our premise in this book, which we will discuss in further detail, is how we can address global inequality through tax justice. Now, for the next 5 to 7 minutes, I will go through a few slides that explain this. And I realize that we have people who are not tax experts from around the world who are live streaming into this event. So I'll try to make it as people friendly as without getting too technical on some of these issues. So with that, let me start with the share screen that we have. I have a few slides that will cover this issue in this. This one. All right. So our title of this book is Tax Justice and Global Inequality. And as I said, we'll be discussing the consequence of global inequality around the world. Now, let's look at what is happening in the developed countries. Just taking the example of the United States, the richest country in the world, there is economic desperation. As some of you are aware, that right now, almost 40% of Americans do not have even $400 to address an economic emergency. There are food bank lines that are overflowing. This is in the richest country in the world. The unemployment, the underemployment is around 20%. 48% of the frontline workers who are responding to the pandemic are not eligible for sick pay and do not have adequate insurance. We have a real economic desperation that is a major problem, even in the richest society in the world, and that is causing poverty, loss of jobs, loss of hope about the future. And when we saw the riots that took place in Portland last year, in 2020, when we saw the riots in Kenosha, when we saw the riots that took place even in Washington, while there may be some sparks to those riots, whether they came from racial issues regarding George Floyd or steal the vote issue, the fact of the matter is that the underpinning of some of these riots relates to economic desperation. And that economic desperation leads to political instability. Now, this is not only in the United States, but it is also in the developing countries. The same pattern of global inequality leading to economic desperation and political instability is happening in the developing countries. I see some photographs here of what happened in Bogota last year, in Uganda, and many countries that around the world we are seeing similar patterns of people getting a sense of frustration and desperation that is causing them to react on the streets with anger and wanting for better justice. Now, the question we ask in this book is, can tax justice be part of the solution? Because if you think about it, what is tax? Tax is simply an investment that communities make in the societies in which they operate, for schools, for education, for infrastructure, for jobs, and everything else that is needed for a society to function holistically. What is tax justice? Tax justice is when people contribute to that society in accordance with their ability to pay, whether it is individuals or whether it is corporations. Everybody is making a fair share of contribution to the society. What happens when there is tax injustice? Clearly, when people are not contributing their fair share, the burden falls disproportionately on those who do not have the ability to take advantage of tax havens, of secrecy jurisdictions, of using trade mispricing or transfer pricing to park their profits in jurisdictions so that they don't have to pay their taxes. What happens when there is tax injustice is that the wealth then accumulates in certain segments of the society, which is the higher income segments of the society, the big corporations, the elite, and the wealth of the lower segments of the society continues to be drained or depleted. Joe Stiglitz, who is one of the members of the Independent Commission for Reform of Corporate Taxation, a Nobel Prize winning economist, has estimated, and he often refers to an IMF study that shows that developing countries lose about $200 billion a year as a result of tax losses due to people and corporations not paying their fair share of taxes through the use of tax havens, through secrecy jurisdictions and so forth. I mean, this $200 billion is a very large number. Let's put this in context. As I mentioned, Dr. Stiglitz estimates and the IMF estimates that the total tax loss by developing countries annually is $200 billion a year. Now, many in this audience may know that the Marshall Plan that helped the recovery of Europe after World War II from 1948 to 1952 was only a total cost of $13 billion at that time, which was loaned by the US to Germany and repaid back in full. And in present day dollars, it is about $100 billion. So this is saying that the developing countries are losing through tax avoidance tactics, through plans that are put in place by big corporations that are operating globally, using tax havens and other jurisdictions. The developing countries are losing 2 times the Marshall Plan every year. Now think of this. If the developing countries that have this natural resources, have wealth, have industrial capacity, had the ability to retain their tax revenues to which they were entitled, rather than have them siphoned off through other jurisdictions, they would have the equal of twice the Marshall Plan every year. That means, I mean, would we see refugees going from Africa to Europe if that was the case in Africa? Would we see refugees coming from Central America, South America to the borders of the United States if they had the wealth in their own countries? No, the answer is clearly the investments in their own communities would have been made possible if tax justice existed in those countries and if the global financial architecture could be such that corrections could be made so that the countries could keep a portion of the wealth that was due to them. And that is why this book is important, because we talk of various ways in which this $200 billion can be clawed back, can be retained by the developing countries, so it can be used as an investment in their own societies for a better future for their own generations, for their own children down the road. Now, I did a lot of work in Africa, and as you know, some parts of Africa are prosperous, but there are other parts of Africa that are going through considerable poverty and civil war and strife. Africa, as you know, I use this as an example to illustrate my point, is the richest continent in the world. There are foreign mining companies all over. Many of these mining companies pay hardly any tax in Africa. I mean, they pay a very nominal tax, but most of the profits are parked in Switzerland or Cayman Islands or other tax havens. And through our work in Zambia, Tanzania, and a number of the other countries where we were involved, we noted that there was incredible wealth below ground and incredible poverty above the ground. And here, on one of my visits to Zambia, I looked at some of the mines where these operations were taking place. And as you can see, even the tire of this excavating machine is 20 feet tall, and I'm standing next to one of them. And what do we have on the other side? We have wealth that is being extracted, and we have an environment that is being devastated, and pollution that is being left behind. So that is not the kind of future we want to leave to our children. And I think that's the point that we are trying to make in this book. So what is the price that is paid for tax injustice in Africa? We have poverty and civil war in certain parts of the African continent. We have a broken society. We have poor infrastructure, and the profits of mining, which should have been retained in Africa, that's where it belongs, is largely invested in banks and in tax havens. And a question one has to ask is this perhaps a new form of colonialism? Have we provided, through the global financial architecture, through financial secrecy, through tax havens, have we provided a getaway car for the stolen wealth? And it's a question that we have to consider, even though colonialism as we know it is no longer there, but the global financial architecture has provided a substitute for colonialism, in my humble view, that needs to be addressed. Then how will developing countries? Now we're looking at COVID-19 because, I mean, that was the system that existed before. Now we are dealing with COVID-19 that is making the situation much worse because developing countries, unlike the West, don't have the luxury of issuing more debt. They're already heavily debt burdened. They cannot just tell their Federal Reserve equivalent to issue more debt and all will be well. So they have to really think creatively as to how they can recover the tax revenue that is their due. The ILO estimates that, International Labor Organization estimates that as a result of COVID-19, an additional 400 million people will become unemployed following this crisis that we are in now. The World Bank estimates that around 70 million people will fall into extreme poverty as a result of COVID-19. So all of these are important issues. Now, who are the victims of tax injustice? Of course, we know that children are suffering greatly. And of course, many of you know that there is feminization of extreme poverty. Women tend to suffer the most, whether it is wars or pandemics or the climate crisis. And this also means that they, who are generally the anchor of most families, are paying a very heavy price for the tax injustice that has come about as a result of global inequality. And you know, the Population Council has estimated that because a number of the women in poorer parts of the world do not have access to reproductive health care, the number of unwanted children every year are at least 50 to 60 million unwanted children every year. Now, if we could provide them the healthcare facilities, the infrastructure to have better control of medical resources, this additional unwanted children of 50 million every year, over 20 years, that's 1 billion. If you compare that to the entire world population of around 8 billion, that means over the last 20 years, we have added an extra 1 billion people to the world as a result of the fact that we are not able to provide healthcare, education, and infrastructure so that women can be in better control of their lives. And when the population demands become very high, what is the effect of it? More farming land needs to be taken over. That means there's more intrusion into nature, into animal habitat. And then the more we intrude into the animal habitat, typically, we create the environment for the kind of crisis we are facing now, which is the pandemic, which is a consequence of man's intrusion into nature. So the victims of tax injustice are the children, feminization of poverty, the women. It affects their children and future generations. It causes unwanted children. It causes further pressures on land. It aggravates the climate crisis and the pandemics. All of this are very closely related things that we need to consider. How tax justice can help is building of physical and social infrastructure, schools, hospitals, public transport, creating a manufacturing base for employment, providing a safety net for healthcare, and restoring a sense of dignity and hope about the future. And in this book, we point out a number of solutions in this regard. Natural resource taxation, how that can benefit both developed and developing countries. We have a nice chapter on transfer pricing rules, formulary apportionment, minimum tax, fair taxation of digital companies. My colleague Erika will speak about her chapter, which is on raising revenue and improving health through targeted fiscal policies. And I would like to add one more point before I turn over to Erika, and that is that 10 of the 12 chapters in this book have been written by women, half of them from the global north and half of them from the global south. And it's another testament to the fact that women as leaders really hold the key to our future, and empowering them and empowering their ideas is very important. And many of these women who have written these chapters come from backgrounds not only in tax, but also human rights and social justice. And that's why I thought that bringing them into this book, bringing their creative ideas into our future would be an important investment. And let me just share this one last slide before turning over to Erika. This is from Blaise Pascal, who says that justice and power must be brought together so that whatever is just may be powerful and whatever is powerful may be just. And that is the challenge that we will discuss more today. So I would now like to stop the share and turn it over to Erika.
Thank you, Krishen. I appreciate the introduction, and thank you so much to Bjørn and the team at GRIP for making it possible for us to share about this book at this very important book launch. And as Krishen said, the book actually provides very practical ways to increase the revenues of developing countries. But I also wanted to mention that the chapters in the book don't just look at international tax rules. They also look at domestic tax policies that are employed, yes, to raise revenue. I think an important point is that making tax work to reduce poverty is a lot about raising adequate revenues, but it's not only about that. Tax policy can be an effective instrument to tackle the erosion of human capital. And that's what my chapter, along with my co-authors Frank Chalupka, Evan Bletcher, and Estelle Doshi, we focused on the role of health taxes in a country to really addressing the massive economic and health costs of harmful consumption of products like tobacco, alcohol, sugary drinks, and junk food in countries. And this affects low and middle income countries in particular, because at the same time as economies are trying to grow and develop healthy workforces, they're also faced with high costs, both public and private, from the diseases and the lost productivity that result as a result of consumption of these products. And in addition to the income taxes, the excise taxes in place are nowhere near to compensate for those losses. So in our health taxes chapter, we actually explore practical ways that countries can increase these taxes. In many countries, goods like tobacco and alcohol are already taxed, but at very low levels. And so we lay out ways that countries can increase these taxes, and we talk about how these taxes can actually address the costs that come from consumption, but also we explain the dynamics behind why these taxes are actually pro-poor. Because the price sensitivity of lower income groups and young people in particular, they're much more price sensitive to taxes. And so they are much more likely to not start consuming these goods and to quit due to reduced affordability. And the only way that you can reduce affordability, the primary way, is to increase the taxes, because that pushes the price up. So our chapter provides one of the practical ways to do this, but also other chapters. I think it's very nice that Tatiana Falcao talks about the role of environmental taxation, both carbon taxation and other environmental taxes to raise revenue, but also protect the environment and address climate change. But she notes the need that this imposition of assessment of these taxes is not just a domestic issue, that a higher level of international cooperation is needed. And she proposes practical steps towards that aim, towards a multilateral approach. The issue of international tax competition in the form of tax incentives is artfully tackled by Annette Ogutu in the context of Africa, and she really gives helpful guidelines to make these tax incentives more strategic, so that countries who want to attract foreign direct investment are actually doing it in a smart way. Some other aspects that we don't often think about in tax policy, like the impacts of bilateral investment agreements, free trade agreements on a country's ability to tax, and also the impact of development finance investments by developed countries into developing countries, that these projects of investment are not evading tax. And so Lori Finnair does a nice job of exploring a case in Finland. Finally, I think the authors Monica Yair and Nikki Reich also take a very important human rights look. And they identify this issue that tax policy is human rights policy. And the overarching issues that Krishen addressed in his introduction really look at how our international tax rules and our domestic tax policy actually affect the ability to mobilize the maximum available resources for the fulfillment of human rights in their countries. And the international tax rules have a lot to do with the ability of countries to be able to raise those revenues to fulfill their human rights obligations to their citizens. So I really appreciate the multifaceted approach of the chapters in this volume. And of course, there are some authors that are not mentioned here who are taking a look at international tax rules. And we encourage you to take a look at the book. But without further ado, I'll turn the time back over to Bjørn and the discussants to move the conversation forward. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Erika and Krishen, for a very good introduction to the book and to the overall aims of the book, and a snapshot of some of the contributions. And I'm really happy to have with me today people who are experts in the field of taxation and tax justice and corruption and economics more generally. And we have two discussants. I would first like to give the floor to Tina Søreide. And Tina is a professor of law and economics at the Norwegian School of Economics in Bergen. She has previously worked at the Faculty of Law at the University of Bergen and also the Christian Michelsen Institute in Bergen. And she's also worked at the World Bank in Washington. And I also know that she's worked a lot on corruption and businesses and ethics, both within Norway and abroad. So Tina, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Now, I think Erika and Krishen described the book very well. And I want to, I think, my main reaction when I read this book is that I found it really, really useful. The book describes how to secure tax revenues in poor countries in a practical manner. So even if Krishen described the broader aspects of injustice, which is also reflected in the book, I found it very, very useful because it says what can be done. The word tax justice in the title is actually not very radical. It simply means that governments in poor countries should take what is theirs to take, the revenues needed for running a society. And I think the practical solutions and examples of countries that made it work is a very powerful message in this book, because it shows that governments can take regulation in their own hands. And of course, when taxation works, it contributes to build trust and workable institutions and a positive circle towards development and sound state building. So it's really, really important messages. And I think that despite an impressive variety of competent authors, each chapter is quite easy to read. The authors explain tax matters in a simple manner, and they go straight to the argument that the chapter conveys, and that means that they bring the reader up to an advanced level of understanding quite quickly. So I think this book will be very useful for governments, tax officials, researchers, students, civil society, and so on. And I have edited some books myself, so beyond the fun, I know that there are some difficulties, so the good result is definitely also a result of the competence and ambition of the editors. Now, having those features, it is an excellent basis for discussion. And I have two remarks, one for each side of the coin, for those who tax and governments, and regarding those who are taxed. And in this context, there's a lot of focus on the firms. So my first remark, I like the way that the authors and editors have focused on problems as primarily a matter of capacity and not integrity. So corruption, which is something that I have studied a lot, as Bjørn said, is hardly mentioned in the book. And I do not interpret it as if the authors naively assume that all governments are honest. It's rather that they have chosen to emphasize the practical solutions. And that's fine. But at the same time, we know that tax reform depends on political decisions and a bureaucracy able to carry out the policy. So, and politically, we also know that it is difficult in some settings to raise a tax. And even if countries have political competition, that can be messy. So, and we know that, for example, in Africa, many countries have changed from a parliamentary system to a presidential system, which means a very strong grip on power. And this is something I studied when I studied gold and taxation in Ghana, that the party whip can be extremely strong. And we also know that the control system, that those who are in the field supposed to tax and control firms and individuals do not necessarily have the competence. So the first part of my remark relates to the political economy of reform, and how can this be brought? How can the good policies be implemented? So I will get back to the question. I just want to run through my second remark as well, and that is and that refers to those who are being taxed. Because the book, in direct and indirect ways, it describes a capitalist pro-rich country grip on some developing countries. And I think that reflects a reality. And the narrative behind the global inequality, the word in the second word in the title, the term refers basically to how powerful multinationals exploit their position and how this is endorsed by OECD countries. So there's a heavy criticism of multinationals, and given the experiences, and Krishen mentioned mining companies in Africa, which I have studied too, so I think that makes sense. So that's not a problem. But so in short, that criticism means that that the relationship between corporations means that there is a harmful race to the bottom in many countries, and that explains why there's so low taxes. This asymmetric allocation of bargaining power between corporations and governments in many settings, and something that corporations exploit for their profit maximization. They exploit opportunities that lie in the transfer pricing rules, excessive debt loading, and they are kind of encouraged by OECD governments in order to operate as if they consisted of separate and independent entities for which the headquarters are responsible only for the profit and not all the problems. So in some sense, because in the chapters, they don't go very much into the corporate side of things. It's more like the corporate world is an evil force that needs to be controlled by fragile, benevolent governments. And there's some truth in that, but it's also a little bit simplistic because we see now that multinationals, they are a varied group of players. Business leaders, there are some business leaders out there who want to contribute to development. And business students at my school, for example, they learn about the triple bottom line, people, planet, profit, and they learn about how their companies depend on well-functioning societies. So one of my questions, the second question, is whether it's possible to use this corporate power for something good as well. I know, having read this book, that cannot be taken for granted. But what I find interesting is how the EU Commission is now in the process of introducing mandatory human rights and environmental due diligence obligations for businesses in accordance with the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, Article 16. So with these are simply the reflections I had after reading the book. So my two questions, just to summarize, is that what are the steps toward implementation of all these good solutions, given the many educated people, networks with competent development-friendly groups in other countries and so on, and civil society with multi-stakeholder groups would be a solution, for example. And the second remark is about the private sector. Would it be possible to imagine a role for the private sector in the reform process, for example, if nudged by these reporting requirements encouraged by civil society? And one of the things I have learned from the OECD process that I've been part of, sometimes we can actually get more support from some multinationals than from governments when it comes to finding pro-development solutions and policies. So I leave it with that because I'm afraid of the time, but happy to discuss more. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Tina, for those reflections and comments and, well, also critical questions, which is good. I have received a request from Astrid to come with her comments just after, because they're complementary and may also illuminate some of your points, and I think we will do that.
Maybe I can respond quickly to what Tina just said.
No, could we just have Astrid's comments first, and then we'll take a longer round. Also, because Astrid Haas, who we have with us today, is the former policy director of the International Growth Center, and she was previously also the senior country economist for cities and head of the Cities That Work initiative at the IGC. So please, Astrid, I'll keep your introduction short because we have a lot to discuss, I think. So the floor is yours.
Thank you. And I'm sorry to come in like that, but we were joking before, if Tina went first, she would take most of what I wanted to say. And, some of that has happened. So I figured, instead of waiting and saying it again, let me just sort of add. So first of all, to compliment the editors and the authors on what is a fantastic book. As you can see, mine is extremely well marked up. I've taken a lot of learnings away from it. I should mention I am from and speaking to you from Kampala, Uganda. So I am from one of those 54 African countries that a lot of the book refers to. And I work with governments across Africa. I'm an urban economist, so I work very much at a local level. Your authorship, it stood out to me straight away. It is very, very rare you pick up a book on tax and that you see so many women and so many contributions from the Global South. And I think this makes it a really powerful read because it is what gives the practical voice to what is being said. So I just wanted to re-emphasize that because it really jumped out at me immediately, and I thought it was fantastic. So as I said, I think my remarks are very complimentary to what Tina has just said. Perhaps like a slightly different angle or nuance. But I think where I would like to just sort of give sort of four remarks are sort of four broad tensions that I see running through the different chapters of the book. So Erika and Krishen, you both, highlighted this, wonderful facet of the book that it looks at tax justice and inequality from multiple different angles. So, health, from the MNCs. I think a particular favorite one of mine was Laurie Finner's book on chapter on the DFIs, because I think this is a really underexplored angle. And yet the DFIs are playing an extremely important role in terms of stimulating the private sector in places where it is very difficult to get to private sector. So I think, there's a lot much more work that is needed there. But the first tension I see, and I think is highlighted across the chapters, is this tension between the necessity to raise revenues and the necessity to pursue other objectives at the same time, be it improving climate change, be it, improving health outcomes. And I think that can't be underestimated, right? It's not that, and I think in Victoria Lee's chapter, she talks about it as needing to have promote an attractive investment environment at the same time raise revenues, right? And I think how we sort of figure out and how we think about that tension is one I see running through all of the chapters. And I think is an extremely, from a developing country government's perspective, is an extremely important question, or from any government's perspective, but particularly here in the developing country. The second major theme I see running through, and Tina, you mentioned this as well, is this focus on capacity. And I, as an economist, we talk a lot about like the first best solution and then the good enough solution, right? And what is the good enough solution given capacity constraints? And this is where I think the book really sort of touches upon very practical sort of solutions. But I think what jumped out to me, and this is in Jörg Eid's and Charles Chilufia's chapter, right? They were talking about joint tax audits, and they mentioned that, for this to be feasible, it would take 12 years of training. And I'm thinking about the governments I work in, right? And training anyone for 12 years to be able to finally do a job just, is unfeasible. And I think that's not just in the governments I work with. I think that's across the board. And actually, in their chapter as well, they mentioned that a lot of, a lot of the colleagues I work with are really fantastic, but they're just, and they say, and I quote from their chapter, they're overtaxed with domestic tax issues, right? And that's it, right? Like, how do you take on a bigger agenda? How do you do that when there's only so many of you with so much time? The third tension I see in this sort of running through the book is this tension of the need for a global solution, but the need for a solution now. And that's a massive tension, because that's a massive global collective action problem, right? And you see it. We talk about being pushed to adopt OECD standards when it comes to transfer pricing. And we see some, and Tina, you highlighted this, there's some really concrete case studies. So I'm going to, sorry, mispronounce this name, so apologies, but Tovani Randriamalina's, chapter I thought was really great, because he provided case studies from different places in the world where that good enough solution was actually a solution to help the now happen, right? So, whilst we figure out the global thing, let's do the now. But I think one of my favorite quotes from the whole book, and this is speaking as an African, is from Mustafa Njawa's chapter, where he said, African countries can take their tax destiny into their own hands. And I really love that quote. I thought that was really powerful. However, my question to you as the sort of editors of this book is, to what extent is that realistic? Tina mentioned things about, the race to the bottom, the, first mover disadvantage, right? And that's in a context of the low capacity that that is highlighted across the book as well. So is it realistic to say, like, okay, on international issues in particular, we can take the tax destiny into our own hands? And my final tension, and this is one where I can only wholly agree with what Tina said, which is around the political economy of tax, right? I think for me, reading the book, particularly the chapters on international taxing, there is some sort of implicit assumption is that if we could unlock that 200 billion, if we could unlock those 2 Marshall plans, then automatically we can solve the world, we can achieve the SDGs, we can solve the health problems. Now, there's a lot of stages in between that. And Erika, you mentioned, there's a touching on domestic tax issues, and Nikki Reich's chapter, she talks about, fiscal policies that exacerbate rather than ameliorate poverty and inequality. And those need to be tackled together. And often when it comes to a domestic level, right, it's not a divorce from the international level. This international challenge of, tax incentives, there's a political economy at a domestic level that can actually sort of support that happening, right? It's not divorced from that happening. There are people benefiting, even at a domestic level in developing countries, from the system the way it is, right? Mining contracts is a fantastic example of this, right? So it's not just, in my mind, about how you unlock that. It's about truly where, Krishen, where you started, it's about, and where Bjørn, you started your comments, it's about the social contract. And so my second question to you is, in this book, but and this is not a criticism, this is just how research is currently set up in the system we live in. People have an area that they research, but actually to me, it's a very integrated issue, right? Solving the tax incentive issue at an international level and unlocking all that money, whether be it from the MNC side, whether be it from some global compact, does not necessarily mean that me as a citizen in my own country is going to have my potholes filled on my road, right? It's not necessarily going to mean that I'm going to have my power functioning. The question is, how do we create that integrated research agenda so that when we think about tax justice and inequality, what we're thinking about is a very holistic, from the international to the national, to the case that I look at, which is the local, and most importantly, to the individual. So those are my few comments on, yeah.
Thank you, Astrid, for not very few comments, but very helpful and incisive ones. And I think this book launch is developing just the way that we all knew it would. I mean, we have to talk a bit more than 1 hour, yeah, in order to reflect on this. But Erika and Krishen, you've received a lot of comments, some critiques, a lot of well-deserved praise. Would you like to respond to any of these questions and comments? I think Krishen wanted to, and now you can start us off maybe. We can't hear you. Sorry, you have to unmute.
Yes, Erika, would you like to go first, or shall I make some remarks? Okay, I'll start and then Erika will continue. I think you have outlined some very significant issues here, which is, how does the political economy of reform really work? Even if we get the international tax system straightened out, how will it filter down to the national level and the local level? Multinational companies are not necessarily the evil force. There are other players that have to be part of the solution. I think all of these are very, very important points. And let me respond in the following way. the biggest challenge, I think the reason why reform is so difficult is that the developing countries are faced with this primary tension of how to encourage cross-border investments, and at the same time to not give away too many concessions to make that investment possible. This is a tension that is every country is facing, and then the fact that each country is facing it makes it very advantageous for the multinational companies to pit one company against the other to extract whatever concessions that they can. And then once the concession period is over, their obligation to stay in their country does not remain the same, and they can go on to other jurisdictions. So this is a tension that always exists. Now, how do we counter that tension? We counter that tension by having, the Independent Commission for Reform of Corporate Taxation has been working on this whole issue of concessions, which saying that this race to the bottom doesn't help anybody. And we need to have a corporate minimum tax so that there is a minimum floor that is payable to all the countries where these companies are operating. Another campaign that has been very successful is that demanding the companies to adhere to country by country reporting makes it possible for the public to really know what exactly are the taxes that are being paid in each jurisdiction. And when public knows more, their civil society is more empowered to hold their government responsible and the companies responsible for the taxes that are due. Now, going hand in hand with the power of the multinational companies, which the tax justice movement is trying to counter, is the fact that we have a pattern of secrecy and lack of transparency that exists, which is again fostered by, to some extent, by the financial institutions and the tax havens where many of these transactions are eventually recorded. For example, Astrid, as you know, I gave the Zambia example. Zambia has more copper below ground than any other country. And yet, because of the relationship with Switzerland, Switzerland, through its subsidiaries that are there for the mining companies, ends up becoming the largest exporter of copper, even though it does not mine an ounce of copper, because they are then rerouted through the Western countries. So I think what is happening is that the power of multinational companies is going hand in hand with lack of transparency. And I think what the tax justice movement has done quite well, and I think to their credit, is that by bringing about country by country reporting, by bringing about exchange of information, by having a campaign for formulary apportionment and unitary taxation, by having a campaign for corporate minimum tax, they take away some of that power that companies have to negotiate on their terms. And then at the same time, by having whistleblowers revealing the real state of lack of transparency through the Panama Papers, the Lux leaks, and so forth, there's a gradual chipping away at the lack of transparency. So power of corporations goes hand in hand with lack of transparency. And to their credit, the tax justice movement and investigative journalism have both been chipping away at these powers, which is what makes me hopeful. And I think it is also a very positive reflection of these times that both the Global Alliance for Tax Justice and the International Center for Investigative Journalism have been one of the nominees for the Nobel Peace Prize this year. Not that they will succeed necessarily, but the fact that their role has been acknowledged as being part of the solution for society is, I think, an important indication of the forces that are at play that prevent reform from taking place and the counter forces that exist to make reform possible. And I think that's the tension that we are trying to address in the book, that until this tension is resolved, let us take control of our own tax destinies through some practical solutions, and at the same time, chip away at corporate power on one hand and corporate and lack of transparency on the other. That would be my response, but I'll let Erika respond with her perspective.
just very briefly, I really want to say thank you to Tina and to Astrid for your excellent engagement with the book and your very thoughtful comments. And given that we've got about 4 minutes to the hour, I just wanted to briefly address Astrid, you made a point, your last point was whether an international solution, an international compromise on taxation would be a panacea. And if that solution, the benefits of that solution would be able to trickle down to the domestic, the national, the local, the individual level. And I think it's an important question. And I don't think that we take that for granted in the book. In fact, in the introduction, you know, we acknowledge corruption, poor management, lack of transparency, and the role of local elites. And you know, I think that's important to acknowledge, but I don't think that can be an excuse for not working toward more simpler, fairer international tax rules in both international corporate taxation, but also insisting on regional international cooperation on things like tax incentives and other domestic tax policies, because we see that when one country implements certain domestic tax policy, that has implications on surrounding countries as well. So I don't think that the excuse that, well, if we have fair rules and if countries, developing countries are getting more revenues, they'll just mismanage it anyway. In fact, I think that's very paternalistic, honestly. I think we need to do, the developed countries need to do their part in making sure that the rules are not fettered with complexity. And the clear winners of that complexity are multinational corporations who have the resources to delve through the minutia and make the gaps in those laws work for them and increase their profitability and their bottom line. And I think for the first time, really due to this pandemic, we are seeing in the developed country context in the US, that we have not made the proper investments at the domestic level, in our public health system, in employment protections. And yet we still have the luxury to be able to issue more debt and send supplies out. Think of the bind that developing countries face in a similar situation. So I really don't think that we should use the fact that, you know, there are weak institutions in developing countries as a cop-out, really, to doing the hard work of coming to an international solution, especially to the international corporate tax rules, because that's where the lion's share of the losses that come from tax avoidance that are really hitting the developing countries. And I like how you also identified this tension of the necessity to raise revenue and also other development objectives like health and the environment. But when we take a closer look in our research, we see that the amount of revenues that we are losing from lost productivity and health costs and dealing with the impacts of climate change are far and above the impacts that would come from actually taxing these goods. So I just want to put that out there, is that what may seem as, you know, tensions on the surface level, actually, when you look at the impacts of these costs on society, those are actually greater in the medium to long term. So I will leave it there. We just have a few more, well, we're out of time, but I'll leave it there for the moderator to take it from here.
Thank you, Erika.
If I can just add one sentence to what Erika just said.
Yes.
I think it was very, very moving for us in my work in Zambia, Guatemala, Tanzania, to see so many local people involved who want their country to be better and to overcome the crisis that they are facing. And they constantly pointed to tax justice as being part of the solution. And the more transparency there is as to how the conduct is of their politicians and the companies, the more they are empowered to act to hold them accountable. So we have people on the ground who are at the local level, national level, who really want to see justice prevail. And the way we can help them is to be transparent about conduct by our own politicians in those countries and by MNCs. And that transparency will lead to social activism to hold both their politicians and companies more accountable. And I think that is happening. You know, when I went to Zambia, Muthembu Nchida, the prosecutor general who's there, who welcomed us, he has successfully prosecuted 3 former presidents of Zambia. In Guatemala, Alberto Fuentes Knight, who was a finance minister, his own father was assassinated during the Guatemalan Civil War for bringing about tax reforms. And yet he took it upon himself to make that his life's mission, to make the tax reforms happen. So there are very many dedicated people around the world who are working for tax justice, and they are a big source of inspiration to us.
Thank you.
Just on my points.
Okay.
No,
okay. I just want to say something as a moderator first. I mean, we were meant to go to 5. We'll go to 10 past 5 if that is okay with all of you. And I will have to include a question or two from the audience as well, because we have been asked a lot of questions. So in order to be inclusive, as we talk about, but Astrid.
No, I just wanted to clarify. I am not in any way saying that. I'm sorry if my comments were misunderstood. My comments were not directed at, we don't need to do the international because of the weak institutions. Absolutely not, right? Like, I am one of those people who's very dedicated to tax justice, living and from Uganda. My point was that I think, or the point that I was trying to make is, how do we address these things as an integrated system, right? Like, not just focus on the one and not just focus on the other, but focus on them as an integrated system. So I just wanted to clarify in case my points were more misunderstood.
We agree with you.
Excellent. Okay, I suggest we do the following. I will give you 2 questions or so from the audience, and then we'll take a round where you respond to those, and then we'll round it off by that. Okay. And the first one is a very general question, but a very important one that has been underlying a lot of the discussions, I think, and that is sort of what can be done to increase inclusivity of developing countries in shaping the global tax architecture. Yeah. So here we would like to hear your reflections on that. And a second one is, in 10 years' time, will we still be talking about tax justice, or will we have moved on to other issues because we have actually managed to accomplish something more or closer to a tax just system? All right. I think we will end with your reflections on those notes, and I think we can maybe start with the discussants and give them like 2 minutes each, and then we will move on to our two editors to close us off. So Tina, please.
Gosh, that's difficult to answer these questions. What can be done to include development? Well, I have been working with the OECD in 3 different working groups, actually. And one of the things that I feel is a little bit unfair in the book, it's not a criticism, but it's just about how the OECD works. It represents the governments. And in the book, it is often referred to policies as an OECD policy. But the OECD is not an institution like, for example, the World Bank. It's an arena for governments to come together. And I think in terms of inclusion and fairness and so on, I think some governments, their attitudes toward justice comes a bit under the radar because they can be covered behind the OECD. And there are some governments that really want to promote development and promote tax justice in various ways. So I think, and I know that because it is referred to many times in the book to the OECD agendas, and I know that many of the working groups really want to include developing countries and bring them in around the table, but there are different opinions. So everything that happens is result of the common, how big the common denominator is, and so on. And in terms of going under the radar, and the second question, 10 years on and so on, I think that also depends on how we, so I'm in Norway, very north country, we work on our own problems. Most European countries are not able, we are better able than in most other regions, but we have big problems enforcing the anti-money laundering regulations, for example. And many of the regulations that could contribute to reduce tax injustice are not sufficiently enforced and regulated in our countries. So I think this discussion, I'm not able to answer where we are in 10 years from now, but I think it depends not only on how well the developing countries make use of the many good solutions in this book, I think it also depends on how we manage to make the pro-development systems work in the North too.
Thanks a lot, Tina. Astrid?
Thanks. So I'll be very quick. I think where we are going to see more inclusivity, and I do think we are, right? I think now it's not just about the OECD anymore, right? We have different groupings of countries. We have regional groupings of countries. Where I'm from, the East African community is taking on tax questions as well now. And I actually think that, you know, as groupings increase, and as groupings increase then in power, that will then sort of come up. I also see a lot happening. I know this is not directly related to tax, but for example, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala being elected to, you know, as the DG of the WTO, I think has been a global reckoning for all multilateral institutions, right? That developing countries and developing country women, as Krishen put it, you know, have a lot to say, right? And I think that's gonna permeate. On the question, and then finally, I think the point that Krishen made about it's not just a government, it's about civil society, and it's about us who are living here, us who need, you know, to hold the system to accountable, us who need to inform ourselves. So I think that's the other part. I think 10 years is extremely optimistic, just because I do think it's a global collective action challenge. However, what I do want to say, and this was the theme of the SDG Bergen conference recently, right? And Bjørn, you mentioned this in the outset of your remarks, is that this COVID-19 crisis has brought a global reckoning. And so what we make out of it now, and I don't think that we know yet what we're going to make out of it. I think we're still coming to terms with it, but it could be a catalyst, and I hope it is a catalyst for a whole lot of change to a whole new normal in the area, in all areas, but in this particular area as well.
Thanks, Astrid. We'll go Krishen, and then the final word to Erika, I think.
Well, Erika, you go first, please.
Okay.
Thank you so much. Yeah, you know, the question about inclusivity in the global tax discussion. The United Nations is the only place where all countries stand on equal footing. I understand that the OECD, through the BEPS process, has made tremendous efforts to create the inclusive framework, to invite countries in, and the discussions there, the intent is for them to be all countries to discuss on equal footing. But I've been a few years back involved in the work on BEPS, and I had the opportunity to be able to attend one of these sessions. And I noted the heavy presence of multinational corporations from the developed countries also in attendance at these meetings. There were developing country representatives present, but the weight of the resources behind the institution and behind the discussions there leans more toward developed countries. These comments are not meant to question the intent or the goals of the process to include all countries on an equal footing. But why not the United Nations, where all countries are there and established institutionally on an equal footing. And the United Nations deals with tax matters. They have since the very beginning, along with the OECD. And they continue to do quality research and work. So they have the institutional capability. So my question is, when you ask about inclusivity in the global tax discussion, why not the United Nations? My second point is, will we still be talking about tax justice? We should, because tax is the way we mobilize revenues, and revenues is the way we pay for social goods, common goods that we all depend on. Regardless if we're rich and powerful or poor, the rich and powerful depend on court systems to protect their private property. So we all depend on these global common goods, such as the environment, such as health. And so we should all make our fair share of investments. So I think we should be talking about tax justice forever, beyond 10 years, because it's crucially important to the well-being and to the security of our future.
Thank you very much, Erika. Krishen, please.
Yes, regarding on the first question about inclusivity of the developing countries, I would have to say that they are much more empowered now than they were 10 or 20 years ago to participate in global forums. And I think it's a tribute to the support that they have gotten from countries like Norway, from Germany, German Development Institute, from the Tax Inspectors Without Borders, the fact that developing countries have much more of a voice through their own awareness of the importance of this issue, through better negotiations with multinational companies on these issues. But the support that has been provided, and Tina, your country has been right at the forefront of supporting all developing countries and upgrading their skills in this regard, is a tribute to this process. And the fact that this launch is taking place at the University of Bergen is another example of the investment that Norway has continued to make. So for that, I think we owe a lot to the ability of developing countries to participate more, and that's going to continue to increase. 10 years from now, going back to my opening remarks, when I talked about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, about the three major crises, will we be facing a nuclear challenge? I think the chances are yes, we will be facing, but it is in our power to act on it. Will we be facing a climate crisis 10 years from now? I think we'll be facing it then, but hopefully we will act in time before it is too late. And similarly, in addressing global inequality and using tax justice as one of the solutions to it, I think we will still be doing it. It will not be completely overcome, but I think we have the tools within our means to do it. And books like these, events like these are part of the instruments to get us there. So I'm hopeful that we will make progress. I don't think we would have reached the pinnacle in any way of success, but it's an ongoing effort. And, I'm reminded of the 4th century philosopher, St. Augustine, who said that hope has two beautiful daughters, anger and courage. Anger at the way things are, and courage to take a stand and to ensure that they don't remain that way. So I think that's where the tax justice movement is. It's much more aware and angry about the way things are, and it is courageous enough to take a stand on these issues. And the 12 authors who have contributed to this book are an example of that courage to take a stand, to point out practical solutions, and to see if we can be empowered to do it. So in that sense, I'm hopeful for success.
Thank you very much. And I think that's a beautiful note to end this on. We need hope, anger, and courage if we are to move towards tax justice. And I would just also like to mention that this is actually a physical book, and you may actually get hold of it through your bookstore. So do go and get it. And it will also be available open access at some point, hopefully hopefully soon. And I think we will have to continue our discussion another time because we're running out of time. So the questions I had are about sort of universal basic income and post-growth and degrowth and taxation. We will have to leave that for another time. But thank you very much, Erika, Krishen, Tina, and Astrid. And also thank you to all the digital participants and to everyone who's posed a question. I'm sorry we did not get around to reply and discuss all of them, but that is how it is sometimes. Okay. Thank you.